My name is Bahery, and my father, Mehdi Bahery, was executed on July 29th, 1981 in Tabriz.
So, before we start, I'd like you to tell me about your family. Where were you born? How many brothers and sisters? What kind of family? Get to know your family dynamics.
Sure. I am the oldest of two children. I have a brother who is 6 years younger than I am. My mother and father actually met in two different but simultaneous occasions. They were both taking English classes in the British Council in Tabriz, so they had some exposure there, and also they had worked together. My mother was a secretarial job and my dad was doing accounting work, so they had more exposure and then they had gotten to know each other. The way I remember my parents has always been that they were the best of friends. I have not seen a couple closer, friendlier, more in cohesion with the decisions they made, and they incorporated that in our upbringing as well. We had a really simple life. My father was a government worker, my mother stayed home, but we never lacked attention and love, and once a year of family trips in Iran, and the way my dad said, he said we need to get to know our own country before we venture out elsewhere. So my childhood was probably one of the happiest childhoods I've ever known. I was always a good student. I took music classes, I took painting classes, and they really focused on our education as much as they could. Whatever they could, as little as or as lot they could, they really focused on our education. I was about 13, 12 when the revolution happened. The way I remember revolution having impacted our family was my aunt's family, my mother's sister. They lived in a smaller town in Jnab. This was the evening of a New Year's Eve, meaning January 1st. Their home was burnt. They left their home with basically nothing except their nightgowns, slippers. They got in the car and they ran. Them and 90 some other households were burnt down. So the first impact of the revolution in terms of us having been Baha'is and having been impacted by it was then. I remember it vividly. And I remember for the first time the anxiety I saw in my father's eyes. And I actually remember him in tears for the first time, saying, not sure what is to come of us. So we had a handbag, a black handbag, with all of our more important belongings, some cash, some jewelry, that we all knew where it was in case they attacked the home for us to grab and go. So as a 13-year-old, this was the first memories I have of the revolution. And of course, the schools closed down. We stayed home for a few months. And we took note of what was going on outside.
Now, the event in Jnab happened before the revolution or after the revolution?
It was January of 1979, I believe. Yeah, this was during the revolution. I mean, revolution had happened. People were in the streets already.
I see. So it's very early on.
Very early on.
You knew that this revolution is not going to be very happy ending for Baha'is.
I had no idea, but I could tell from the way my parents were under stress and in some anxiety that this could go in either direction.
Would you say that day that you saw your dad anxious and in tears, that would have been the end of your childhood?
Not quite. I remember the day he actually packed his bags, took my grandmother to Tehran. Remember, we lived in Tabriz. So I think there was another significant day. And these are, of course, I have formulated them later when I've looked back. So I will go back a little bit. Mr. Astani and Dr. Samandari were executed in 1980. So the way it worked was my father was on a list that would replace the members of the local spiritual assembly as they were executed, because they could not be continuous election. So they had the name. So my father was on the second list. So he immediately took over. And they used to meet, from what I have heard, I have not even verified. Remember, I was a teenager. People would not tell me anything. I was just a really nosy teenager and very curious. So most of the information I had was really actively seeking out answers. So I know that they met in the cars, in people's homes and so forth. So very soon after, we realized they would be coming after him. He's already on the list to be arrested. So my grandmother was ill. My dad took her to Tehran, more like an excuse to get away and also seek some medical treatment for her. I believe that is when I realized our life would never be the same. I somehow intuitively must have known that. And I think that's when I really grew up. I had to look out for my brother, and I could not burden my mother any more than she was already burdened. So I lived in my own world and how I dealt with things.
So when did, now the news of those two executions that came, your father was in Tabriz.
Yes.
How did you hear about them?
I think we heard it in the news. And of course, it was such a big deal. Dr. Samandari was one of the most well-known physicians in the city. He was a university professor. He was my physician. I used to go to him for my chronic tonsillitis. So I knew him. And Mr. Astani was one of the most well-known merchants in the city. So this was a big deal. This was one of the first, it was the first executions of Baha'is in Tabriz. So it made a lot of noise.
Now, in terms of you and your mom, of course, I'm sure your dad knew the significance of replacing them in that assembly. But what about you and your mother? Do you remember that you talked about the possibilities or probabilities of never?
Never, no. Like I said, nobody included me in adult conversations.
But
So,
were you aware? Were you scared? Were you?
I think honestly, when I look back, you're so in the middle of things. It's so hot and so acute. We must have been in denial about most things because we knew it's inevitable for an event to happen. But were we worried about it? I think we constantly lived in fear. We constantly lived in anxiety. But we chose maybe not to think of the outcome. Even when my father was in prison, and we'll probably get to it soon, everything was laid out very clearly. People that went to prison never came back. But we still were hopeful every single week, even when they were tried, and we knew that more than likely, just like anyone else, they would be executed. We still hoped for an alternative plan. So I think in the middle of all of it, we just kept hoping.
But do you remember witnessing anything in your mom's behavior, dad's behavior, or other people around you that things are not the same anymore?
Oh, we knew it wasn't normal. My dad was very distracted. I remember he came back from Tehran, and I went to hug him, and I could just tell he was tense. Yes, and he was arrested a week after that. So he must have sensed coming back to Tabriz would mean that he would be arrested.
despite that he knew that he came back?
You know, he said, I can't always be on the go. If they're going to get me, they're going to get me. He has an uncle that lives in Germany and was an engineer for Audi. And during the revolution, around 79, he kept telling my dad, you know, why don't you come? You can easily get a job. I will make sure we do. I remember this very clearly. He said, okay, so I leave. How about people that live in such a neighborhood? What are they going to do? So he was really thinking, okay, if we have the means, there are so many others that don't have the means. What are they going to do? So I think his decision was for the greater good than for himself.
Mm-hmm. Now, from the time that he became a member of, basically a member of assembly, till they arrested him, how long did it take?
2 months.
2 months. And then, do you remember the day?
He was arrested on 24th of Mordad, which is somewhere mid-August. Yes, it was noon. We were having lunch. It was a Friday. Later we learned, my dad wrote to us and said, the day he woke up that morning, that Friday, he woke up with the sound saying Zindan, prison. Interesting enough, the assembly meeting was supposed to be in our house that day. He got up, didn't say anything to my mom, called another assembly member, changed the location. And I remember my mom sort of being a little upset, saying, you know, you have so many places you can hold these meetings. Why are you changing it? This is as good as any. You know, let's not worry about it. Let's just go on with your plan. He said no. So he changed it. At 12 o'clock, somebody called him, introduced him as someone he had worked with. And he said, I want to come in and go over some accounting issues. They made a plan for 1 o'clock. Sure enough, at 1 o'clock, the Revolutionary Guards knocked on the door and came in. So this whole thing happened in the span of 2 months.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Revolutionary Guard were they armed? Do you remember?
2 were and 2 weren't.
Were they wearing uniform or?
None of them were wearing uniform. No, not this time. Our house had been searched heavily twice before in our absence. They had come into the house, they had gone through the house, they had basically opened every drawer, every school bag, dumped it out. They were looking for something, obviously, and they hadn't taken money or jewelry, so they were after something else. So this would have been 3rd time. Actually, no, they did come another time. They searched our house. They were looking for books. They took a lot of Baha'i books. So when they took my dad, it was actually the 4th time. From the 4 of them, one sort of took the role of introducing himself to us. He had a subpoena, I guess, that he had permission to search the house and to take my father. My mom at that point basically sat down. Later on, he said she felt paralyzed. She couldn't see, she couldn't talk. She sat there because she must have known this was it. And I took over. I read the letter, and they had taken my father to our dining room, which was private, sort of cut off from the living room. I knocked on the door. I went in. I said, really, when I think about this as a teenager, I must have just been being a teenager.
How old were you?
I was 14. I said, I don't want you to be talking to my dad alone. I have every right to be here. I think they just humored me, and they started trying to convert me by showing me letters indicating that Baha'is were spies, that my dad was a spy, that we were some Zionist sect of some sort. And I kept conversing back and forth. The guy got really mad at me, and he basically said, get out. So I left at that time. And they went through everything. We're talking underwear drawers, books. And they went to my room, and I was learning English at the time. My dad was teaching me English. And I was reading some little books, and they were holding the book upside down. And I went and grabbed the book from his hand, and I said, you have it upside down, because I was so angry. I just had to sort of let it out in some way. So they took those, they took some birthday cards we had received from family in England and the US as evidence of our spying. Yeah, they just basically searched whatever they could find, whatever books they could get, and they left, and they took my dad with them.
They were not violent?
They were not violent at all, no.
Because the reason I asked, because in some instances they have been very violent, actually beaten up old women and all that. So depending on who comes in. Okay. Now, what was the household after your father was taken away? What was the conversation? And I want you also to talk about your brother, his reaction on that day.
That's a sore subject.
Yeah.
My brother was only 8. So I don't know what must have gone through his mind. And I don't remember what really was, thank you. I don't quite remember the details, except everything was chaotic. We had family members that came. We were trying to find out how we would know where he is, where he's taken. I mean, they had history of taking and assassinating people. We weren't really sure if these people were legit. So from what I have remembered was we knew that he was in solitary confinement for 24 hours. And then he was put in with other Baha'is who were they were already in prison. I think there were 6 or 7 at the time. I can't quite remember, but there were a number of them in Tabriz prison. So we had to wait till the next time we had a visit, or families went to visit, to know that my dad was okay. He was in fact with them.
So you knew immediately where he was, and you could go and...
In about a week or so we found out, okay. Yeah.
So was there any visitation rights?
Yes. We had weekly visits. The visits would be about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They were either Fridays at some point, Thursdays, Panshanbe budan. They were on Thursdays, and later on they changed to Tuesdays. Now, I was in school, my brother was in school, so we didn't always get to go. And you have to remember, we had to get permission from our principal to actually miss school, and to go and tell them, yes, I have a dad in prison that I'm going to visit was quite problematic. So I used to actually sneak out for those days. And my other friends would cover for me. So I didn't see my dad as often as my mom and his sister did. They were there every single week without exception. They would start out at 4 or 5 in the morning. They would stand in line. They would get called, and by the time we got to visit him, it would be about 1 or 2 in the afternoon.
So while your father was in jail, how much certain were you about the fate of that? I mean, you and your mom and...
Of his fate?
I mean, what is about to happen to him? How certain were you? Having experienced all the things in the past.
I really think we were just in denial or hopeful. They had not been tried. And we were optimistic that once they're tried and they have a chance to speak, they'll know the allegations and spying charges were just ridiculous. So they would be released. Since
so you actually believed that what they are basically told you about the spy is really their real purpose.
well, we thought at least that's what their belief.
Yes.
They
So-
believe these guys are spies.
I see.
You know, you just think the best about human beings. You think, well, they must really have a belief system that they're going by. And it wasn't until we were actually really excited once their trial came that, well, finally there is some resolution to this.
And then, so at home, you and your mom, of course, your brother was very young, but never talked about the possibility.
Oh gosh, no.
Never.
Ever, no. My mom was in a great deal of stress. She and my aunt, my dad's sister, actually went and met with Ayatollah Madani at the time. He was the Imam Jumeh of Tabriz. And another person, I can't remember, another clergy, just to see if things can be speeded up or some resolution for this matter. And they had said, and he had asked my mom, what is his crime? And my mom had said, he's a Baha'i. And his answer was, the world is full of Baha'is. Why would you care? Why would we care that your husband is a Baha'i? So basically, nothing really happened. So I knew they were constantly doing work. They were constantly trying to find answers, or at least, resolve issues. But I also remember that my mom would not sleep most nights. As we went into the winter months, and with the relationship they had, they were always so thoughtful about each other. My mom would say, if your dad was released tonight and he came, he wouldn't knock on the door, he wouldn't ring the bell. So she would often stay awake just to go to the door to check and see if anybody was behind the door. Because, like I said, she knew he would be so thoughtful about her, about us, and he wouldn't ring the bell. So I remember all of these things. And we also had phone calls that would tell my mom, if your husband does not recant his faith, we're going to steal your children, we're going to raise them as Muslims. And I know that was very painful for my mom, that, we were at danger. So we used to be escorted to school and back, and being a teenager, that was not cool, So I sort of negotiated with my mom to have me go with my friends, that I would always have a friend with me, and that was okay. But my brother, my mom would always take him to school and back because he was really, really young at the time. So events were happening. It wasn't just, but it didn't have directly to do with my dad's fate. I personally never thought something could happen. About 3 months before he was executed, this is when general executions in the entire country, the early 60s began. And they would read off the list of names. Excuse me. They would read off the list at the news. So our days, and this is going into summer months again, I would remember my mother or my grandmother would get up in the morning, listen to 8 o'clock news, and then the names that were there and the names that were not there. Basically, we just waited to hear, or hopefully not hear, our loved ones' names. And then it would be 10 o'clock news, and then 12 o'clock, and then 2 o'clock. And later on, I think the last one was about 10 o'clock news. We would hear and we would sleep. So for about the last 3 months, this was our routine. So we must have expected it. We must have known this was pending. Were we hopeful? Obviously.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you remember any of your visits with your dad?
I do. My brother and I were both on top of our class, had always been. So we would take our report cards to him, and that was the highlight of it. And he always loved it. He always said he was so glad that what he was going through wasn't affecting us in school, and he would applaud us for that. He actually wrote few poems and, you know, birthday notes and so forth in the hem of a towel that he would send out for us. So our meetings were no more than 10 minutes, and it would usually be my mom, my aunt, sometimes my elderly grandmother, who would really have a hard time coming to prison. And this was her only son. So we couldn't really say much other than just, how are you doing? How's school? You know, just the formalities of conversations.
How did he look?
He always was in his prison clothes. He looked always well shaved, clean, and he looked well. He was never sick or anything, but he often would say, almost in code words, that he's hoping to come out and write a book of the time they have spent in prison and what has gone on. I remember one time there was an international monitoring system, the person that came to check the prison and their health codes. And apparently they had found cockroaches and so forth. And so my dad alluded to that in terms of his conversation with this investigator. And then we had one and only one face-to-face visit. It was about 34 minutes. I remember exactly. We were called. This was about May of the year they were executed, so about 3 months before he was executed. They just promptly, they gave us a visit without any previous knowledge. We went in. I remember we were all excited, and my brother was standing on the side. Later he said he was so scared if he went and hugged my dad, that the guards would hurt him later, that they would hurt my dad. So he was so cautious to be respectful of that. But then my dad put him on his lap, and my mom asked about the food. He said, well, the rice is so dry, it basically clicks as you pour it into your bowl. But he said, you know, history of faith has shown worse for people who have endured it. Who am I to even complain? He also said, I think it was then that he said, when I come out, I'm going to write a book about what we have gone through in the last few months. So he was even hopeful.
So also, do you have any knowledge whether he has been tortured while he was in jail?
I don't believe so, and I don't believe so. I know that when they received the bodies, again, I overheard this conversation, and no one ever told me this. I know his arm was broken, but they had also concluded that it must have been from the free fall after having been shot. It wasn't actually a fracture that was imposed during the torture, because none of the other ones were. So I don't think so. I think most of the torture he endured were mental, emotional. He was a civil servant of 24 years for the Ministry of Health, and being very young and having young kids, his concern was always our financial security. So one night they called him at a time that they would normally take people to execute. So he basically said goodbye to everyone and went off, and they delivered his dismissal from work. So he lost whatever benefits they would get after 24 years of work. Yeah, so that was one thing, and I think he had been told several times that we would take your kids and raise them. So he would always tell my mom, watch out for the kids, don't let them be alone. Yeah, so no, I don't believe there was any physical torture.
Now, when was the last visit?
Last visit was on Tuesday. They were executed on either Wednesday night, on the 7th of Mordad. We met him on Tuesday, 2 days prior to it. They had a trial on Sunday. His trial was late at night, I believe about 2, 3 in the morning. And we heard about this on that Tuesday. There was a tape recorder that was recording the conversation. He had a list of questions in front of him that he was supposed to answer, and there was one person in the room. There was no judge, no attorneys, and apparently the guy was falling asleep, so my dad would stop only because he was asleep, and he would wake up and say, just answer the questions, because it was being recorded. This was mostly for formality's sake. And when we asked, we were excited. We had been waiting for a trial for about 11 months. So when we said, well, this is great, so what did they say? They said, we have been accused, I guess, by then they were convicted of مفسد فی الارض و محاربه با خدا. But he had not received a sentence. He said, the sentence, they have told us it would be in accordance with Islam. So we got excited. We thought, wow, these are godly people. Their sentence would be in accordance with Islam. So we have nothing to really worry about. I mean, this is how naive we were.
Having seen all the other Islamic convictions before that.
Yeah, I think hopeful is more like it. We were just hopeful. We were holding on to the last straws of hope. You know, the rumors of their executions came out a night before that, because a Mr. Musavi, named person, had said, I'm going to kill these 9. And the stories, of course, I've heard, I have no documentation for it, but the stories came out later. He said he had said he's going to kill these 9, and then he's going to fast for the month of Ramadan with a purity of mind. Well, he happened to have, so he signed the sentences that were going to be carried out that night. He left the prison. He was assassinated at the door of the prison in the car of Dr. Dakhili's confiscated car. So there was a lot of ironies in that he actually never really lived to see that day. So the news came out, the rumors came out, and we sent people to every hospital, to every morgue to see if we could find them. Finally, we had a family friend, a doctor, who contacted the prison doctor, and he had said, the sentences have not been delivered yet. Even then, when they said it hasn't been delivered yet, we didn't hear the yet part. We just said it hasn't been delivered. So we stayed at my grandmother's house that night, which was on top of a hill from prison. It was a summer night. We had the windows open. We heard gunshots. My mother sat up and said, oh, you know, some poor families, loved ones are killed. We knew it was coming from the prison. And
your house was that close to the prison?
Not our house, my grandmother's house. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was on top of the hill, so it was drawing a lot of this sound. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it must have been them. It just made sense later. So the next morning, my mom and I took a cab back to our house. And by the time we got to our house, we knew people were waiting there. So they didn't have to say anything. We knew that the sentence had been delivered. And
who was waiting for?
The same aunt that we had just left at my grandmother's house. Somebody had driven her to our house before we could get there, because we had to walk a certain distance. So for that, to see her shoes at the door of our entranceway. We just saw her, and we knew she lost it. We knew what must have happened. They had basically picked her up, come to pick us up and take us to the cemetery.
How did she know?
They had called from prison. They had called few families to come collect the bodies.
Mm-hmm. So what was, and your brother was with you also?
No, my brother was at my grandmother's house, had stayed behind. The sadness with that situation that I know he still deals with is for about 3-4 days in the midst of sheer chaos. That's the only way I can describe this, is he stayed there. My mother called him, said, there's stuff going on. We're just, you stay there. So in a 9-year-old mind, he said he knew. But not to be able to have those questions answered, not to be able to be there, to cry with everyone else, and to go to the cemetery, and to just go through the whole grieving process. It must have been hard because I was in the middle of it, I was feeling it, I remember it. But as a way to protect him, he stayed with family for those days. So, yeah.
I want to know your reaction on that day, because of how you felt about a possibility of this all thing being resolved. Suddenly, being your aunt there, what was going on in your head at that time?
There's a picture that will never leave my mind. When we talk about those defining moments, it's the color of my aunt's shoes. It was a cream and kind of an orangey sandals she had. I will forever remember them because that was synonymous to me with my life being over. By the time I saw my aunt, there was screaming, wailing, crying, and so forth. And knowing that my life, as I had hoped for, will never be the same. And here I was on my way to go bury my father. For 4 days, I basically heard nothing except crying and wailing, to the point that when I went to bed, I would still hear it. So, yeah, my world was upside down. I was going to go back to school and had to deal with questions, with teachers. I mean, this wasn't even in my realm of concern at that point. My concern was, this was unbelievable. My dad was laying there with gunshot to his head. He was buried in front of my eyes. This wasn't something I could be hopeful about anymore. I couldn't dream about the possibilities. I couldn't be hopeful about things. He was being buried right there. So, yeah, reality hit me pretty hard.
Did you actually see your...
I did. I went with my mom. Again, I wanted to because I couldn't believe it still. He had already been washed. He was already prepared for burial. I just remember smelling rose water. I remember the only shot that was covered with a chalk-like, acrylic-like material. That must have been what they do to ensure that it's over. Yeah, I did see him.
I'm sorry that you have to revisit those instances, but I think for the sake of seeking justice when the time comes, these are necessary. Absolutely.
No, I have forever felt I've got over it. and I feel strong. I always feel I'm on top of it. But how could have this happened? I mean, there's still a sense of, yeah. And you have to also remember, back in 1981, we basically never felt heard. Our neighbors came to us, they were kind. They would say things like, well, he was such a good man. But we also knew in the back of their mind was a question, wow, he was such a good man, but what if he was a spy? And we never knew. So we almost always felt we had to prove ourselves. There was also that taboo subject. I went back to school, and my brother went back to school. I can't imagine what he has gone through. People used to throw questions at him such as, well, if you don't have a dad, then how do you buy these clothes? How do you live? And things that only 9-year-olds would be able to formulate. And it would really bother him, or especially when he was in prison and the questions he would get. So, yeah.
How long after the loss of your father did you leave Iran?
I left almost, pardon me, 4 days after I turned 18. So about 3 years after.
Did you leave alone or with your brother?
I did. No, unfortunately, they just couldn't at the time. I had finished high school. In the entrance exam for high school finals, امتحان معرفی, I scored the highest in 4 provinces. So, and I always wanted to continue, go on to university and so forth, and I knew my chances were basically 0. So, and my mom, being the selfless mom that she has always been, she made it very possible for me to leave. And the way I was going to leave was going to be either through the border to Turkey or to Pakistan. I remember at that time, my mom gave me a very difficult task I didn't appreciate very much at the time. She said, if you want to go, you have to do all the research yourself and you have to find this person who's going to smuggle you. I will interview them, I will pay for it, but you have to find it. So of course there were a lot of Baha'is who were leaving through the border, so I knew people and we went to their house and found out how their daughter had left and so forth. But I basically left through the border to Pakistan.
With others?
There were 3 other Baha'is and another guy in our group who was running from army service.
Was it any incident on the...
Yes. Gosh, this could be a movie on and of itself. It was pretty amazing. And at the time, you know, being 18, it just seemed so adventurous. But I remember that we waited for the sunset. We got in the back of a Jeep. So they basically handed us off at several points. So we finally got into a green Seymour. Our luggage were in the back, we were all sitting, and then we got into a dried riverbed. It was very rough. As we were drying with no lights on, somebody turned around and said, they're after us. So Revolutionary Guards or Border Patrol, they had their lights on, they were chasing us. He drove really, really fast. The suitcases were getting thrown around. They were hitting our head, but he was determined to get out. So he got into a little village. I remember curtains went up in one of the homes. He drove through, curtains went down. We just sat there still. We stayed there overnight, actually, until everything was quiet. And we walked, climbed a little hill, and went over, and there was someone else waiting for us on the Pakistani side.
So then what happened to your mom and brother?
My mom and my brother, I did not see for 14 years and 16 years. So.
Who you saw first?
My brother. My brother. I left, I was in Pakistan for 6 months, then I moved on to Canada. I lived a life on my own for about 12 years. I finished my undergrad. Then in 1995, after having worked, I taught college, I taught chemistry and microbiology. Then I wanted to continue on, and I had been waiting a few years to save up money, do what I needed to do. I applied for a chiropractic college in Portland, Oregon. So I came down in September of 95, and by then my brother had gone through his own journey, which to me is very fascinating. He was a top student as well, couldn't go to university, couldn't leave Iran, the circumstance of our family and what they could and could not do. So he entered the Baha'i Institute of Higher Learning. And he actually was one of the first graduates. He finished the dental program. So he, by some mere coincidence and just a miracle probably, he worked in a non-profit clinic for a whole year. He didn't get paid, or he got paid very little because it was a non-profit, but nobody figured out he was a Baha'i. So someday they came in to check for licenses and so forth. And he basically said he didn't have it on him. They must have gone, investigated. They came back for him. He just left from the back door, never went back, and shortly after had to leave because by this point, they were after him. So this coincided with me living in Portland, and he moved. He came to Portland in, I believe it was 96.
Did he also have to go through the borders?
He didn't know. By that time, Baha'is were able to get passports. So he went to Austria and through an organization was able to get permanent residency status to the U.S.
Your mom?
And my mom went through the same route my brother had, only because after both of us having been gone, it really became unbearable for her to be by herself. She was getting older, and also economically, Iran was really taking a nosedive, so things were really hard for her. So she left 2 years after, and she arrived in April of 2000. She arrived, so I guess it would have been a few years after that. So in April of 2000, she arrived in the U.S.
Can you describe the moment?
Oh my God. I have the pictures and I look at them and I think my mom had probably 16 years pain in her face. Yeah, I look at her and it's almost like with every tear that is in the picture, there's that 16 years of pain of your child being away, not being able to know what we have both gone through. We made every effort to really stay closely in contact. I mean, as much as we could call descriptive letters I used to write for them. But there's so much that has been missed in between. You know, I went from being an 18-year-old to being a 33-year-old. So by then I had gotten married and my mom couldn't be there. So that was really emotional for both of us.
Do you have children?
I don't.
No. So where's your mom and brother?
They both live in Portland. My brother has his own family. He has two little kids, 6 and 5, soon to be 7 and 5. My mother lives there. It's home. Portland has become home because that's where my anchors are.
Mm-hmm. Now, having lost your father the way you have, which is not normal, like everybody loses their father one way or another, but the way you have, how do you think that has shaped, influenced your life?
In every single thing I have done and do and will do, that's in the forefront of my conscience. I think I have so much more compassion for the suffering of people. I hope I do. I think I have become very closely in tune with pain and anyone that goes through pain.